Welcome to I Got Stuck, a catalog of temporary obsessions, with me, your host, Dr. Kelly Reedy, wherein each week I'll give you a full report on the latest topic that's kept me up at night. Things that have led to countless hours of procrastination through Googling, asking Jeeves, and navigating the twistiest and turniest of internet rabbit holes. By the way, don't feed carrots to rabbits. It gives them tummy aches. This is the story of Balloon Mania, or the history of ballooning, and by association, parachuting. And the first thing you need to know is that I have never been in a hot air balloon. And the same goes for anything related to a parachute. So everything I'm going to tell you about today, I'm doing it through a veil of what I think is very healthy fear. So here I go. I'm going to be brave and tell you everything I know. The story of Balloon Mania starts with the Montgolfier brothers, Joseph and Etienne. And if you think they were professional aviation specialists, you are wrong. The Montgolfier brothers were paper manufacturers. Until one fateful day when one of the brothers, Joseph, was sitting around watching his laundry dry. And in this case, that meant staring at damp fabric that was suspended above an open flame. Joseph noticed all of a sudden that the fire was causing pockets of air in the fabric, which pushed it up. Joseph was no scientist and had no idea what was going on, but he thought it was interesting nonetheless. So he took a guess. His guess was that there must be some extra type of gas involved in the release of smoke from the fire. And then he named this special new type of gas after himself. He called it Montgolfier gas, which you likely haven't heard of because it's not real. But this behavior that he observed that he had never noticed before led him to make the first successful hot air balloon with his brother. Scientists had been researching flotation for a while, and they understood that the key to flotation is density. Air molecules have a particular density, and for something to float up in air, that something needs to be less dense than the air itself. And of course, generally speaking, the density of air goes down as the air heats up. Hot air is less dense than cooler air, which is why we say hot air rises. It's all a matter of density. So Joseph Montgolfier noticed this effect of the hot air pushing the fabric up, and supposedly he was also kind of daydreaming about war while gazing at a painting of Gibraltar that hung over his fireplace. Quick sidebar, a notorious problem of the time was that nobody could attack Gibraltar because it was just too dang hard to get to. People couldn't get to it by land or by sea. And remember, this is the 1700s, so those were the options. Montgolfier thought, hey, what if we make a big version of whatever's going on here with this billowing fabric and use it to attack Gibraltar? And he and his brother Etienne got to work. They made a bunch of little prototypes, and then when they felt pretty confident about their idea, they started to make bigger ones. I will say that there are a lot of different versions of this story and a lot of different sets of details that I found in my research, but the gist of it is the same in all of them. In the summer of 1783, the brothers decided to do a public demonstration. They had built this big balloon out of silk and lined it with paper. It was really big. The diameter of it was 33 feet. They filled it with heated air by having a big fire of wool, damp straw, and old shoes under the opening of the balloon. And that's kind of an interesting thing. They didn't understand the physics behind it, as you know, that hot air rises, and all they needed was hot air. At this point, they still believed that they had produced a new substance called Montgolfier gas, and they also believed that the densest, thickest possible smoke worked best. Hence the burning of wool, straw, and old shoes instead of something normal like wood. So they made their old shoe fire, they heated up the air inside the balloon, they launched it, and it flew for about 10 minutes. And it traveled for a little more than a mile, which is pretty good. There was nobody in it, but still, it's a pretty big accomplishment. But the obvious problem is that in order to keep a hot air balloon in the air, the air inside the balloon has to stay hot. And that wasn't easy with the Montgolfier system. They'd have to attach a constant fuel source. That's a lot of wool and old shoes to bring along, and it would be pretty heavy. And then starting a fire like that under a silk and paper balloon in the air was, of course, pretty risky in terms of the whole thing maybe catching on fire. One other option was to use a lighter element like hydrogen. If you fill up a balloon with hydrogen gas, it floats in air because hydrogen is less dense than air. The Montgolfier brothers had done some experiments with hydrogen, but they couldn't figure out how to contain the gas, so they ended up with their hot, dense smoke system. Old shoes. And then right around that time, a French physicist named Jacques Charles solved the problem of how to contain the hydrogen. Instead of a paper and silk balloon like the Montgolfiers had made, Charles used rubber-coated silk to trap the hydrogen. In August, so this is just 2 months after the Montgolfiers' initial balloon flight, Jacques Charles did his first demonstration flight, and his hydrogen balloon flew a whopping 15 miles. Recall that the Montgolfiers' first attempt had traveled just a little over 1 mile. So this hydrogen balloon went 15 miles, and it landed in a village outside of Paris where it was promptly destroyed by terrified villagers with pitchforks who had not heard about the launch and thought this thing was a monster. But back in Paris, balloons were all anybody was talking about. A French newspaper declared it to be balloon mania. Tens of thousands of people attended the balloon launch experiences, even hundreds of thousands in a couple of cases. People were putting balloon images on everything: wallpaper, jewelry, clocks, furniture, clothing, and it even inspired some hairstyles. Benjamin Franklin wrote to a friend, "All conversation here at present turns upon the balloons and the means of managing them so as to give men the advantage of flying." And another guy added, "Among all our circle of friends, at all our meals, in the antechambers of our lovely women, as in the academic schools, all one hears is talk of experiments, atmospheric air, inflammable gas, flying cars, and journeys in the sky." And it must have been so exciting. One launch observer wrote, "It is impossible to describe that moment. The women in tears, the common people raising their hands to the sky in deep silence, the passengers leaning out of the gallery, waving and crying out in joy. The feeling of fright gives way to wonder." But on the flip side of that, people would sometimes start to riot if they got to a balloon demonstration and things were taking too long or weren't flashy or impressive enough. It was truly a wild time in history. Louis XVI, who was king at the time, had to get in on the action. The main balloon dudes at the time were the Montgolfier brothers and Jacques Charles, the hydrogen guy. The Montgolfier brothers were invited to come do a big demonstration at Versailles for Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette and whoever else showed up. This was a pretty big gig for them, and the competition and the mania were really heating up. So the brothers very wisely decided they better get an expert involved this time. They got in touch with a friend of theirs, a man named Jean-Baptiste Révillon. And he was, a scientist? An engineer? Nope, he was a wallpaper designer. And he designed a fancy wallpaper cover for the balloon that had a lot of stuff on it they thought King Louis would like. And so, with their fancy wallpapered balloon, they traveled to Versailles on September 19th, 1783 for the demonstration. Around 130,000 people showed up to watch. There had been an advanced communication in which Louis suggested they put some people in the balloon to see what happens to them. And he specifically suggested prisoners. Most versions of the story say that the Montgolfier brothers vetoed that pretty fast. Whatever happened, the first passengers were not prisoners. They weren't even humans. Instead, the first passengers were a duck, a sheep, and a rooster. Their logic was the rooster was used as a control since it could fly and it probably wouldn't get hurt. The duck was used because it can fly, but it doesn't usually fly at high altitudes. And the sheep, it was apparently picked because of its similarity to humans. The balloon, with its 3 esteemed passengers, was launched, and it flew for about 8 minutes and traveled around 2 miles. And I know right now in this moment, some of you don't care because you're still worried about the rooster, the duck, and the sheep. Well, luckily, I have good news. They survived, and they were even called heroes by the press. The official quote that got printed in the news was, "It was judged that they had not suffered, but they were, to say the least, much astonished." Now that we know the animals traveled safely and had their minds blown, I'll tell you again, the balloon flew for 8 minutes and traveled for around 2 miles. That's no 15 miles of the hydrogen balloon, but it's better than the brothers' first test that only flew for about a mile. And then fast forward to a couple of months later, in November. The brothers were finally ready to test it out with people, again for a big demonstration. The lucky fellas were Jean-François Pilatre de Rosier, who was a physics teacher, and the Marquis d'Arland, who was a military officer. And everything went perfectly. They flew 6 miles in around 25 minutes, getting a little better every time. At this demonstration, Benjamin Franklin was in the crowd, and he wrote in his journal, "We observed the balloon lift off in the most majestic manner. When it reached around 250 feet in altitude, the intrepid voyagers lowered their hats to salute the spectators. We could not help feeling a certain mixture of awe and admiration." After that first manned flight, de Rosier, who was the physics teacher who flew in the balloon, decided to do some experiments on his own. He designed his own new type of balloon. His was a combination of the 2 types that I told you about. It used both hot air and hydrogen. If you're thinking that's a potentially extremely bad combination, you're right. He had them in separate chambers, but they must not have been well sealed or something, because in 1785, when he tried to cross the English Channel in one of his hot air hydrogen balloons, the balloon basically exploded. It caught on fire, it deflated, and it crashed. But he was the first person in the world to die in an air crash, so that's something. On that note, during Balloon Mania, there was another innovation race going on. People, and balloonists in particular, were trying to figure out the parachute. The idea of a parachute goes back to at least the Middle Ages, when a Spanish guy jumped from a tower while wearing a large cloak. Sounds pretty cartoonish. This guy was trying to fly by wearing a big coat, and he failed. But he did survive. And then there were lots of other attempts at similar things with similar designs, including by Leonardo da Vinci. But I want to skip ahead to 1783, back to Balloon Mania.
Balloon Mania.
In 1783, the first recorded public parachute jump was done by a Frenchman named Louis-Sébastien Lenormand. He actually was not a balloonist, but he was a physicist and chemist. He just had really good timing with Balloon Mania. He started with also a cartoonish setup, 2 umbrellas that had been rigged into a parachute. And for his first experiment with that, he jumped out of a tree. After more tests and experiments, he ended up with a more sophisticated working parachute that he used in his big public demonstration. This was in December 1783, and he started with 2 umbrellas that had been rigged into a parachute. And for his first experiment with that, he jumped out of a tree. After more tests and experiments, he ended up with a more sophisticated working parachute that he used in his big public demonstration. This was in December 1783, and Joseph Montgolfier was there in the audience to watch the whole thing.
Balloon Mania!
By the way, 2 years after that demonstration, Lenormand coined the term parachute, a combo of the Italian para, which means something like to resist, and the French chute, meaning fall. So the word is totally literal. And a semi-technical thing is that up to this point, the parachutes that existed were fixed canopy style, meaning they were already open before the jump started, essentially big cartoon umbrella parachutes. And then André-Jacques Garnerin got into the parachute game. He was a student of the guy who made that hydrogen balloon that traveled 15 miles, and André-Jacques Garnerin invented the frameless parachute, which is pretty much what you picture when you think of a parachute. He was primarily a balloonist, so all his demonstrations and experiments involved balloons. In his first public demonstration, he attached a silk parachute to the basket part of his balloon, And when he got up to around 3,000 feet, he cut the cord that connected the basket part to the balloon itself. So he and his basket were only connected to the parachute. Apparently, the basket swung like crazy the whole way down, and he got the first recorded case of aviation motion sickness. But he was okay, and after that, people started using parachutes as safety devices in hot air balloons. But that wasn't the end of the story. Garnerin kept going and did more tests. In 1798, brace yourselves, he even wanted to take a woman up in a balloon. This was a really big deal, as you can imagine. The police, in particular, did not like the idea. Their primary concern, so they said, was the effect of the air pressure on the delicate organs of a woman. But also, they really didn't like the idea of a man and a woman being alone together in a balloon. What if she passed out, they said, for example. The police said no to the idea and wouldn't grant the permit. But Garnerin was determined, and he asked to speak to their managers. He took the request up a level in the police department, and that worked. He got their approval. The official statement they put out was, there was no more scandal in seeing two people of different sexes ascend in a balloon than it is to see them jump into a carriage. Citoyenne Henri was chosen as the woman. The flight went perfectly, and even though several other women had been in balloons, Citoyenne Henri somehow got credited as the first woman who ever had the courage to trust herself in the regions of air. Another amazing woman in this balloon world was Jean Geneviève, who was Garnerin's student and later became his wife. She was the first woman to make a parachute descent from a balloon. And she did a lot of ballooning and parachuting with Garnerin until 1823 when tragedy struck. He was building a new balloon and he was walking around the construction site when he got hit in the head with a falling construction beam. He died instantly. I forgot to mention this earlier, but he was at some point during his career appointed as the official aeronaut of France. What a great title. So while Garnerin's invention of the frameless parachute was a great addition as a safety feature in ballooning, it clearly didn't always help. Ballooning was still extremely dangerous. There's the ground stuff, like what happened to Garnerin himself, but the air was still dangerous too. For example, Jean-Pierre Blanchard, who was a really famous balloonist, had a heart attack while he was up in the air in a balloon. The heart attack caused him to fall out of the balloon, and he died because of the injuries from that fall. It was shocking and scary and extra sad because he and his second wife were kind of a ballooning power couple. By the way, he abandoned his first wife for ballooning, and she died in poverty later on. But his second wife, Sophie Blanchard, was the first woman to work as a professional balloonist. She was a really big deal in her own right. She was a favorite balloonist of Napoleon, and she was even given the title of Official Aeronaut of the Restoration by Louis XVIII. When Jean-Pierre died, Sophie continued ballooning. She started doing night balloon flights and would stay in the air all night alone. He had left behind a lot of debt that she had to pay off, so she started doing riskier balloon things for money. She made a trip across the Alps. She almost died after landing in a swamp in Italy. Because of a storm, she had to go up to altitude so high that icicles formed on her face. And she started shooting off fireworks under her balloon and dropping them down to the earth via parachute. Another money-saving strategy was that she switched to using a cheaper type of balloon. She switched from a hot air balloon to a hydrogen balloon, and the hydrogen balloon had a teeny tiny basket. So the materials were cheaper because it was smaller, and she didn't have to keep a fire going because it was hydrogen. And I strongly encourage you to go look up a picture of this teeny tiny basket she was in. It looks really terrifying, and I'm willing to bet it's worse than whatever you're picturing right now. Nobody knows for sure what happened at her public demonstration on July 16, 1819, but it was Sophie's final flight. People had warned her about how dangerous the fireworks and hydrogen combo was, and it seemed like she was finally starting to listen because as she got into the balloon that night, she said, "Let's go. This will be for the last time." except she said that in French. And she was right. She lit fireworks and dropped them to the ground using little parachutes, as she always did. But something went wrong, and one of the fireworks went up instead of down. The whole balloon caught on fire. One observer wrote, "It lighted up Paris like some immense moving beacon." At first, people thought it was part of the show, and the crowd was going wild. Meanwhile, the burning balloon started to fall, but she was throwing out ballast to slow it down, and it looked like that was going to work. But then a terrible thing happened. The basket crashed into a roof. Sophie tumbled out, fell off the roof down to the street, broke her neck, and died instantly. It was a horrible, horrible event witnessed by thousands of people, and news spread fast. Sophie's story was referenced in works by Jules Verne, by Dostoevsky, and by Charles Dickens, among others. And Sophie made history even in her death by becoming the first woman to be killed in an aviation accident. Oh, and one more thing. Supposedly, the character of Amelia in the 2019 movie The Aeronauts was partially based on Sophie. And it has a 72% on Rotten Tomatoes, so I might actually be giving that a watch. But for now, this is where I'll leave you. I hope these inspiring and tragic and kind of bizarre stories of balloon mania lifted your spirits. Until next time, stay curious, don't forget to look up, and no open flames near hydrogen.
This theme song was written and recorded by Clark Blomquist.